It was another roller coaster week for energy prices. After OPEC and its allies resisted calls to increase output, the price of Brent crude surpassed $80 per barrel and reached its highest level in 3 years. The cartel said it would stick to the gradual increases in output it agreed to over the summer. The energy shortage rattled other financial markets too, as investors worried about the fallout. In America and Europe, government bond yields climbed. In Britain, the yield on 10-year gilts jumped to its highest since May 2019. A hormone called relaxin helps loosen up pregnant women's hips. Without it, the pain of delivery would be unbearable. Its job done, however, relaxing lingers in female bodies for up to a year, when softer ligaments make new mothers more prone to injury, as Jessica Ennis-Hill, an Olympic champion heptathlete, discovered in training after giving birth in 2014. 5 years later, Dame Jessica started Jennies, a fitness app to help other women perform safe postnatal workouts. It now lets users optimize workouts for the different phases of their menstrual cycles, and has just concluded a successful funding round. On the face of things, it seems both absurd and unfair that large American companies regularly whittle down their tax bills, taking advantage of every loophole on offer. One study found that at least 55 big companies incurred no federal taxes at all on their profits in 2020. A proposal being discussed as The Economist went to press, and as the Democratic Party scrambled to fund its social spending package, seems to offer a popular solution: a minimum tax on corporate earnings as reported to shareholders, rather than as massaged down when reported to tax collectors. The Democratic Republic of the Congo will hold an election in December, hopefully leading to a peaceful, democratic transfer of power for the first time in the country's history. Sitting President Joseph Kabila came to power in 2001, having succeeded his father, Laurent Desire Kabila, after his assassination. Joseph Kabila was elected as president in 2006 for a 5-year term, and re-elected in 2011. Though his second term ended in 2016 and the DRC constitution prevents him from seeking a third term, elections were not held and Kabila remained in power. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the first part of its latest assessment report. The Earth is warming. Even with a drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, temperatures will probably be 1.5 degrees Celsius above their late 19th century levels by 2050. Climate change is underway, the report laments, with all the environmental consequences that brings. The extent of the damage depends on the cumulative buildup of emissions and can be limited if the world strives for net zero carbon emissions. It might sound obvious that if you want to improve a robot's software, you should improve its software. Agrim Gupta of Stanford University, however, begs to differ. He thinks you can also improve a robot's software by improving its hardware, that is, by letting the hardware adapt itself to the software's capabilities. As they describe in Nature Communications, he and his colleagues have devised a way of testing this idea. In doing so, they have brought to robotics the principles of evolution by natural selection. They also cast the spotlight on an evolutionary idea that dates from the 1890s, but which has hitherto proved hard to demonstrate. European market is a tough terrain for food delivery firms. Delivery Hero has had a good run in the past couple of years. In August 2020, it ascended to the DAX, the stock market index of Germany's most valuable listed firms. It is present in 50 countries on 4 continents. Revenue for the third quarter was €1.8 billion, $2 billion, a jump of 89%, compared with the same period in 2020. We grew 100% before Corona, 100% during Corona, and we will grow 100% after Corona, says Niklas Osberg, the Berlin-based firm's Swedish chief executive. By number of orders, Delivery Hero is more than twice as big as DoorDash, its large American rival. Like every farmer, Courtney Hammond, who grows blueberries and cranberries in Washington County, Maine, has a lot of worries. He frets about weather, invasive species, failed crops, and global prices. To abide by federal food safety laws, he has had to do training, maintain meticulous records, have insect and rodent control plans, and document daily the sanitation of his processing equipment. It is a tremendous amount of work, but it means, he says, I don't have to worry about anybody getting sick from eating anything that leaves my farm. Now he is worried that a new law may put his hard work in jeopardy. Earlier this month, 61% of voters opted to change the state constitution to ensure that all Mainers had a right to food, the first law of its kind in America. On August 4, explosives aboard 2 drones flying near Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro as he spoke in Caracas were detonated. 7 people were injured. Maduro has used the incident as a pretext to crack down on Venezuela's opposition by unleashing the regime's secret police. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert said, "The United States condemns the political violence that occurred on August 4 and urges the Maduro regime to respect the rule of law, exercise restraint, and safeguard the presumption of innocence for all accused." High staff churn is here to stay. Retention strategies require a rethink. In the not-so-distant past, bosses did not have to worry as much about their workforces. Newcomers could absorb the corporate culture osmotically. Workers' families were invisible, not constantly interrupting Zoom calls. Employees had a job, not a voice. Now firms have to be intentional. Management speak for thinking about everything from the point of the office to how staff communicate with each other. Retention is the latest area to require attention. The spike in staff departures known as the Great Resignation is centered on America. A record 3% of the workforce there quit their jobs in September. In 1945, while in a state of exhaustion, the mathematician John von Neumann had a kind of stammering premonition. He was in Los Alamos, working on the atom bomb, and he told his wife Clary that the energy source he was helping to develop would make scientists the most hated and also the most wanted citizens of any country. Then he informed her that his other ongoing project, the computer, would one day be even more important, and, potentially, even more dangerous. Good biographies of some of the greatest mathematical minds are rare, because they were polymaths, biographers who can interpret their manifold achievements for the ordinary mortal are themselves thin on the ground. This has been von Neumann's fate, and the upshot is that he has not had the recognition he deserves. The United States has confirmed that it will pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Washington has informed the United Nations, formally implementing a decision by President Trump in June. But the State Department said the U.S. would continue to participate in climate change meetings until the withdrawal process was completed. New research indicates that weather-related disasters could kill more than 150,000 people in Europe each year by the end of the century. The European Commission report estimated that heat waves would cause 99% of all weather-related deaths on the continent. The Venezuelan authorities say they have suppressed what they termed a terrorist attack on an army base in the city of Valencia. Diosdado Cabello of the governing United Socialist Party said, loyal troops re-established security at the base. Officials said 7 people have been arrested and at least one of them died. Afghan officials say at least 50 people, including women and children, have been killed by militants in the northern province of Saripul. A spokesman told BBC that insurgents attacked security checkpoints and entered a village, killing civilians, among them women and children. He said Taliban and Islamic State fighters were involved, but Taliban has denied killing civilians. They say they killed 28 members of a local militia. Executive Vice President of the U.S. government's Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, David Bohidjian and other U.S. government officials traveled to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia in August to promote U.S. investment in those countries. OPIC is the U.S. government's development finance institution. It mobilizes private capital to help address critical development challenges and in doing so, advances U.S. foreign policy and national security priorities. On August 14, the U.S. delegation met with Armenian Minister of Economic Development and Investments Artsvik Minasyan. The spinal cord, the link between the brain and the body, is a band of nervous tissue about the thickness of your little finger that runs through the backbone. Nerve cells called motor neurons convey electric impulses that travel from the brain to the spinal cord, branching off at the appropriate point and passing to the various parts of the body. Similarly, sensory neurons transmit messages from organs and tissues via the spinal cord to the brain. But the spinal cord also functions without the brain having to intervene. It alone controls those actions called spinal reflexes that need to be carried out very fast in response to danger. Paper was first manufactured in Europe by the Spanish in the 12th century, although it had been imported since the 10th century. Around the year 1276, a mill was established at Fabriano in Italy. The town became a major center for papermaking and throughout the 14th century provided most of Europe with fine quality paper, which it has continued to produce ever since. By the 15th century, paper was also being manufactured in Germany and France, and it was not long before both countries became almost completely independent of material bought overseas. With the increasing availability of paper in Europe, the production of identical printed pictures became almost inevitable. Before farming was introduced into Scotland, people lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foodstuffs. This way of life meant that they usually didn't settle permanently in one place, but were to an extent nomadic, moving about in search of a livelihood, perhaps returning to the same places at certain times of the year. It is believed that the islands of Orkney were known to these people, but, so far, only a few flint tools have been found to verify this. This is because coastal erosion has destroyed many ancient sites, and these may have contained relics of some of these earliest pioneering colonists. It isn't necessary to have a specialized knowledge of, say, the intricacies of counterpoint, or even to be able to read music to understand it. Usually, getting the point of a piece of music, its emotional and dramatic impact, is immediate or simply requires you to become more familiar with it. Of course, prolonged study of music and its composition, as in any other field, will increase your understanding, but not necessarily your enjoyment. Now, I realize that it can require a good deal of willingness on our part to risk new sensations, and there is a lot of music that will seem unfamiliar and alien to you on a first hearing. To be honest, the biggest problem for most undergraduate students, in terms of academic writing, is not only adapting to a far more structured and formal style, but also learning how to ascertain the difference between important, valid information and unnecessary or even irrelevant material. In my experience, I would say it takes students their first year, if not longer, to appreciate what is required and to start to implement those requirements in their writing. What they really should be doing, if they are struggling with written assignments, is to seek help from the excellent support services which are available at the university. This week we're going to be continuing our discussion of women in society. Last week we looked at a number of issues relating to women in education. If you remember, we discussed women both at school and at university. Today we're going to be considering the roles women play in the workplace. Again, we'll start by taking a historical perspective, and inevitably you'll find that many of the same events that impacted on women in education also had a major influence on their working lives. In the second half of the lecture, I'll concentrate on the situation in Europe today, and I'll invite you to suggest how you think things are likely to develop over the next decade. 0K, so let's get started. The earlier chocolate was quite unpalatable. They used to add things to it to make it more palatable, so for the early chocolate, they didn't know how to extract all the cocoa fat from it, so it was, or could be quite, greasy, and if you made it as a drink you'd have this sort of scum on the top. So they used to try and add things to it, like starch and things, to make it a more palatable product. So there were a lot of scandals around the kind of things they were adding to chocolate in the 19th century. So by the sort of 1870s, 1880s, there are people like Cadbury saying, our chocolate is absolutely pure. We have this new process, the Van Houten process, which now extracts all this horrible fat that we can use to make eating chocolate. Now we have a pure product. There have been many studies in America of the opinions and behavior of university lecturers and professors, and of well-known free or public thinkers who are not attached to a university or other institutions, which show that those who are recognized as being more successful or productive as scholars in their field, or are at the best universities, are much more likely to have critical opinions. That is to say that they are more likely to hold liberal views, in the American use of that word, than those of their colleagues, who are less creative or who have less of a reputation. The better a university is, as measured by the test results of its students or by the prestige of its staff, the more likely it has been that there will be student unrest and a relatively left-of-center faculty. The growth of the modern state brought with it the development of mass political parties and the emergence of professional politicians. A man whose occupation is the struggle for political power may go about it in two ways. First, a person who relies on their political activities to supply their main source of income is said to live off politics, while a person who engages in full-time political activities, but who doesn't receive an income from it, is said to live for politics. Now, a political system in which recruitment to positions of power is filled by those who live for politics is necessarily drawn from a property-owning elite, who are not usually entrepreneurs. However, this is not to imply that such politicians will necessarily pursue policies which are wholly biased towards the interests of the class they originate from. The spinal cord, the link between the brain and the body, is a band of nervous tissue about the thickness of your little finger that runs through the backbone. Nerve cells called motor neurons convey electric impulses that travel from the brain to the spinal cord, branching off at the appropriate point and passing to the various parts of the body. Similarly, sensory neurons transmit messages from organs and tissues via the spinal cord to the brain. But the spinal cord also functions without the brain having to intervene. It alone controls those actions called spinal reflexes that need to be carried out very fast in response to danger. Millions of roses get handed out on Valentine's Day. But growing roses has an environmental impact worse than many other crops. Start with climate change. Most roses in the US and Europe are imported from warmer climes. All that flying and trucking adds thousands of metric tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Then there's all the water needed to, well, water the flowers. And the runoff fouled by copious quantities of pesticides needed to make the roses look perfect. There's also the wildlife and workers poisoned by all that fumigation. Add to that habitat destruction, where floral plantations displace native forest and wetlands. Finally, there's the refrigeration needed to keep those blooms fresh. The electricity is often produced by burning fossil fuels, and the refrigerant gases also exacerbate climate change. A more sustainable and, possibly, more romantic approach is to go with flowers certified by outfits like Very Flora, or even better, whatever flowers are in season locally. Of course, that's not much help for those of us in wintry climes. Maybe try writing a poem. Let's see, roses are red, violets are blue. Signs secure borrowing remains robust, and firm data on manufacturing and retail sales, released on Thursday, paint picture of an economy that has yet to be cooled by the recent spate of interest rate rises. A new process for 3D printing things could pave the way for lighter, faster aircraft that, potentially, fly further on the same amount of fuel. Today's airplanes are held together with thousands of metal rivets and fasteners. That's because the lightweight but strong, aluminium, alloys used for their frames are considered unweldable. Try to weld them and you get a phenomenon called hot cracking, in which the finished alloy weakens and fractures as it cools. This and other adverse welding effects also stand in the way of 3D printing high-strength aluminium alloy parts. When researchers have tried, the resulting laser-fused mass flakes away at the welding area like a stale biscuit. His year marks the 400th anniversary of the first permanent English settlement in America. A group of Englishmen, including John Smith, who later was befriended by Pocahontas, built a fort at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, 13 years before the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower. And for the past 14 years, Bill Kelso has been working to uncover the secrets of Jamestown. As with all human behavior, there are numerous reasons for it. But often it's caused by someone who feels the need to show their superiority over someone else, in order to feel that they aren't at the lowest level in hierarchy or a group of people. In some cases, one person simply dislikes the other, on the basis that the personality of one is in some way incompatible with that of the other person. A lot of people just don't feel quite human without that morning cup of coffee. Now, a study finds that the enhanced sense of well-being that caffeine can cause is reflected in our perception of words. Specifically, caffeine increases the ability to recognize words associated with positive thoughts, but doesn't provide the same boost for words with negative or even neutral associations. The research is in the journal PLOS One. Scientists assigned 66 subjects to one of two groups. Half got a 200 mg caffeine tablet, a dose equal to almost 3 cups of coffee. The other half received a sugar tablet. 30 minutes later, the volunteers were shown strings of letters, and had to decide as fast as they could if a string formed a word or was just gibberish. The volunteers recognized words with positive associations much faster than either negative or neutral words. Other studies have shown that positive words tend to be recognized more quickly, but the caffeine increases the gap. So next time you wake up with a grumpy sweetheart, your compliments might be appreciated more if they have a cup of coffee.